There's a reading assignment in your book on Plato's theory of forms, but I'm going to go through a PowerPoint that actually was compiled from a discussion of it in a different book, one called Philosophical Conversations that I used to use. And it's a very good but fairly detailed presentation. This basically relates to the other meaning that Plato was trying to convey in the allegory or the myth or the parable of the cave. In other words, one of the things he was trying to get us to see is that philosophy prompts us to challenge ourselves on the reasons why we accept the beliefs that we do, right? To turn around and start coming out of the cave and examine, the reasoning behind our beliefs. And it goes in with what we were doing last time about a philosophy paper. We're saying take a position and defend it, or look at the arguments that other philosophers give for a particular view or position. And so, the thought is, if you can give good reasons in support of a position, you've got better reason to hold it than just that, hey, everybody in my society believes X, or my buddies believe X, or I saw X expounded as a view on the internet, and so, where X is some belief. So Plato wants us to examine our beliefs, but he also had a second meaning in mind in that story of the allegory of the cave, and that involves not only getting out of the cave, not only turning around and looking at the things in the fire, but he raises the question of whether true knowledge deals with things that are even more certain and more sure than the things we're acquainted with down here. Looking at Plato's theory of reality, the shadows represent images of things, right? If we had more light in this room, we would have the shadow of a desk. For Plato, images of things are real, but they're not very real, right? And they might be very poor copies. A shadow of a chair is obviously a pretty poor copy of a chair. But Plato thinks that even good copies, like, say, the reflection of a chair in a mirror or in water, or a chair that somebody draws, or a chair or something that a sculptor would make, those are still images of reality, and they're removed from reality. And this is the sad condition of the prisoners in the cave, is that what they think is real, and the most real stuff, is really the stuff that's as far removed from reality as you get. They're dealing with only images of the real. But Plato wants to convince us that there is another world, a deeper reality, where things are even more real than the stuff you and I think are the most real. And this is another way how we're like the prisoners in the cave. I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and listen to this, to a show that they discuss everything under the sun, and they had a skeptic on there last night, and I'm sure he denies anything having to do with God or religion. For him, what's real is the material world. Matter is the only thing that he thinks science can defend as far as what exists. And there are people today who believe that. There were people in Plato's time that believed that. But Plato's going to try to convince us that what we tend to think of as most real are like the shadows compared to the most real things that there are. Plato thinks that there is a world of ultimate standards, call them blueprints. And things in this world are more real than things in the world that you and I grew up in. And this is another reason why we're like in the cave. We grew up like Madonna, right? Being a material girl or a material guy in a material world, right? And we tend to think this is most real. I did a little TV thing for the same company that does the Real Housewives of X. I call it the Real Housewives of X because they started out with New Jersey and now they're everywhere. But I was on that, but a different show that they do. But anyway, for them, life is about acquiring possessions. But Socrates questioned that. That's what he was talking to the children of Athens about. He says, well, just being wealthy doesn't make you a good person, but if you're a good person, the other stuff's going to come. But care first about the condition of your soul, and whether you're doing the right thing. And Socrates says, well, this is what I was really teaching the youth of Athens, and if that corrupts them, then I guess I am their corrupter. So Plato and Socrates are trying to convince us that there's a reality beyond this. This is the reality that Meno's slave boy was trying to recall. See, Socrates and Plato both believed in reincarnation. They thought that our soul was once in an immaterial world where it knew things like perfect triangles, perfect squares. We knew what perfect justice was, what perfect moral goodness was, but we've forgotten it. And so part of philosophy is to try to recover genuine knowledge, which for him is not just, for him it's only at best true opinion, beliefs about things in this world. In Plato's story of the cave, even the real objects that this guy sees that are illuminated by the fire are material things in this world. And as such, they come into existence, they go out of existence. But for Plato, they're less real than the eternal things in what he calls the realm of the forms. And so, in that story, the fire, stuff in the cave is stuff in this world, and the objects in the cave that the people are carrying that are illuminated by the fire are the material things we see in this world, and the fire represents the sun in this world. Whereas when we go out of the cave represents for Plato an eternal world, an unseen world that our senses don't know anything about, but our reason can put us in touch with things like the perfect concepts of justice, perfect triangles. And Plato is trying to convince us that there are eternal standards for what makes a triangle, or a circle, or for what makes justice, justice, for what makes a just law, a just law. You know, and his story about what philosophy ought to be doing is it ought to be getting back to this kind of knowledge. So things in this world are real for Plato, but for Plato in this other world there's an eternal standard for what makes a chair, and for what makes a triangle. And those standards are more real than particular triangles that I could draw on the board. Right now there aren't any triangles on the board, right? I can take a marker and I can draw one that didn't exist a minute ago. And I can also erase it. And for Plato, the eternal standard, what he calls the form, for what makes a triangle, is more real than any particular triangle. The eternal standard for what makes a chair is more real than any of the material chairs you and I come into contact with. But having grown up in the cave, in the material world, we tend to think these are the most real things. Plato says, no, what philosophy ought to be about is getting back to things that our soul once knew in a more perfect way before it became incarnated. And he says our souls long to get back there, too. That's part of what Socrates meant by thinking that there are better things for us in the afterlife. So these are called forms. Now, there's another thing to point out here. When we said Socrates tried to distance himself from the nature of philosophers, Socrates was more about answering questions like, how should we live? What's a good life for a human being? Is it just a life of wealth and power and prestige and a good job, or is it something more than that? And he tried to distance himself from any association with the nature philosophers, whose theories he was exposed to. Socrates came from wealth. He was poor as a philosopher, but we know that he came from a wealthy family for various reasons. And so he did have a formal education in the theories of these pre-Socratic philosophers. But Socrates tried to distance himself from them. So you can say, well, wait a second, Professor Murawski. Here's Socrates in Plato's book, The Republic, getting out, in the story of the allegory of the cave, folks, I'm glad to see everyone here. And I know it's an early class, but, I would ask folks to really make an effort to be here on time, because it is disrupting to have people come in the middle, so have some consideration for your classmates, as well as me. But the point is, you're going to disrupt your classmates more than me, a baseball pitcher, there can be 50,000 people in the stands. The only thing he is focused on and he sees is that catcher, what the catcher's signs are, and the batter in front of that catcher, and everything else fades in the distance. And that's how you tend to be if you're lecturing up here. I'm like zeroed in on what I'm trying to say next. and I don't get distracted very much, but people who are trying to listen do. So, okay, so at any rate, here's basically the story. You get Socrates trotting out this elaborate two-tiered theory of reality, that there are two worlds. There is this world that is real, but not as real as an unseen, immaterial world of perfect eternal objects. What gives? I thought Socrates wasn't as concerned about these kinds of metaphysical views of reality. Well, there's been a debate, and it still goes on, about how much of Socrates, the real Socrates, is there in Plato's dialogues, and how much is Plato using the character Socrates to get out his own more well thought out, more complex views of philosophy. Well, the position on this that I think is the most reasonable is that in the early dialogues, like that one we saw, the Meno and the Phaedo, where Socrates discusses life after death, the Apology, and those early dialogues probably give us a picture of Socrates that's pretty doggone close to the real Socrates. But as we get into things like the middle and later dialogues, and the Republic is the middle dialogue, you begin to get more and more Plato. So Socrates had beliefs like this about the forms, but Plato really crystallizes it into a formal philosophical view in a way that Socrates would not have. So that's kind of where we're going with this. Well, I wanted to do a bit of a sell job on this and to try to fit this into context, or else you might, if I just dove into the PowerPoint, you might think, well, okay, this is so different from anything we've been discussing so far. Basically, today we're going to try to get you out of the cave, at least as far as Plato. You know, and so this is one view of what philosophy is. You know, it's getting us out of the cave. You know, that philosophy ought to be about pursuing some eternal truths. Now, you can say, hey, look, I mean, today, you know, a lot of stuff's relative. Everything's just relative to culture. Isn't that the real trendy view? You know, isn't it old-fashioned to think that there are things that are eternally true? You know, well, you might think relativism is the in thing, the trendy thing. There were relativists in Plato's day. They called themselves sophists, but they held the same kind of relativistic views that are espoused by many philosophers today. Sartre, who we'll see later, is a good example of this. Cultural relativism in ethics. And so, you know, this raises a debate in philosophy that goes on to the present day. Are we in pursuit of some knowledge that's deeper than just knowing what our culture believes about morality or about what's real or about science? You know, so the forms. This is not an easy discussion, but it's a fairly deep discussion, not only of Plato's view of reality, and Socrates pretty much believed this, but Plato set it out in a systematic theory in a way that Socrates wouldn't have done. So again, Plato was responding to the relativists of his day. And the skeptics, and who just claimed that real knowledge is beyond any of our abilities. we ought to be skeptical about knowing anything that isn't just relative to culture, you know. And the best we can do, say the people who Plato's reacting against, is just have what we consider some true opinions. I mean, it would be a true opinion that there are 35 chairs in this room, if there were, you know, about things in this world. Or things could be just relative. There aren't any eternal standards, you know, for what makes a particular action right or good. It all boils down to a person's or a culture's opinion, and one person's opinion is as good as another. Each person is the measure of what seems right to him or her. So Plato's reacting against the relativists of his own day. And there are people today who believe that philosophy should be about more than just saying all we can do is be skeptical about acquiring knowledge, or all we can do is know better our own culture's standards, who think we can go beyond that. So for Plato, real knowledge differs from the kind of mere opinion we can have about things in this world. And he thinks that we have knowledge, but real knowledge is about eternal, unchanging objects. When the boy comes, Meno slave boy, comes to have knowledge about geometry, what he has knowledge about is not knowledge about the imperfect sand drawings that, you know, Socrates draws at his feet of geometric figures. What he has knowledge about are the eternal standards for what makes lines and triangles in the realm of the forms. So one argument that these eternal standards exist is that they need to be there for real knowledge to be knowledge. So knowledge has to be what's true. I mean, it's odd to say we know something that turns out to be false, right? If I said, hey, I know the Ravens won the Super Bowl this year, you'd say, how can you claim to know that? They did. They weren't even in the Super Bowl. You know, I mean, it would be odd to claim we know something. But generally, if we know something, we also believe it to be true. It's odd to claim that we know what we don't also believe. So belief is necessary for knowledge. But again, philosophers think that real knowledge is something that we ought to be able to give reasons, good reasons, in support of an argument. You know, so it ought to be justified by reasons. This is one of the most long-standing views of knowledge in Western culture, and basically, it's the view that knowledge, and I'm not going to go into this in any more detail, but knowledge, it's too early, is true, justified belief. That you need all three, that you need to believe something's true, it needs to be true, that is, what you believe has to correspond with the way things actually are, and there ought to be some justification in support of the truth. Okay. So again, for Plato, opinion, even true opinion, is about things that are changeable. It's about the things inside the cave. True or false, not necessarily grounded in good reasons and acquired by persuasion, might be of the shadows we come into contact with, whereas knowledge is about enduring things, always true. In other words, if a right angle in geometry is always 90 degrees, that's not something that's going to change. We had triangles when I went to Poly, you know, and a right angle back. I know it's hard to believe, but we had triangles back then, and a right angle was 90 degrees, just as it was if any of you took geometry in high school, right? Right angle was 90 degrees. What was the right angle in Plato's day when Euclid, who first set out in a systematic way what we all take as plane geometry in high school, Euclid set it out in a system based on 5 axioms. He was a contemporary of Plato. So Plato was very influenced by this view that you know, we can have real knowledge of stuff that doesn't change. So it's always true, grounded in reasons, and acquired by the type of instruction you saw Socrates do with the boy. And you'll see, we even have a slave here, right? You know, there's Socrates making the drawing there in the sand, but what Socrates thought he was doing was moving the boy from some opinions he had to knowledge by taking him through a process of questioning that allows the boy to discover reasons why, you know, if you want to make a square twice the size, you build it on the diagonal, you know. And I'm going to give you a quiz. Have you all do that problem? No, not really. So opinions about geometry in the slave boys were supposedly there at birth, but he needed to be questioned to see the supporting reasons and to enable him to rise to the level of knowledge beyond true opinion and recall the truths his soul learned. So Plato thinks that in this realm of forms, that's where the gods are. That's where our soul most wants to be, because it's like these forms. It is immaterial, unseen, for Plato, eternal, just like, you know, the eternal truths of geometry. So the slave boy's knowledge then is not about the things in the sand drawing. Genuine knowledge for Plato is not about those kinds of fleeting and changing things, right? Genuine knowledge is not acquired through the senses. And this raises an issue that has been a point of debate throughout the history of philosophy. Can our reasoning abilities put us in touch with some knowledge that is surer and on a better footing than information we can get through the 5 senses? And not surprisingly, philosophers have come down on different sides of this issue. You and I grew up on the side that says, hey, look, if we know something, it's because we got it through our senses. Whereas the other side says there might be some things that our reason puts us in touch with that gets us beyond what our senses can do. So genuine knowledge for Plato is about what's enduring. And for him, it's acquired by reason. So the unseen world of the forms is inaccessible to us through our 5 senses. But for Plato, our reasoning part can learn some of these truths or relearn them, or as Socrates says, recall them, right? Again, his story is we knew this stuff. The soul knew this stuff, but it's so shocking for a soul to become incarnate in a body. Let me go past. Well, okay, I'll sign. That this knowledge is knocked into a kind of latent state, and that's why we need to do philosophical investigations. That's why we need questioning to bring it back out. Now, I'm not asking you to buy Plato's, I mean, there are some real issues with Plato's view here, but I'm asking you to try to understand it. But if you think about it, you think, well, did triangles just come into existence when the first person drew a triangle in the sand, in other words, does what it is to be a triangle, did that only come into existence when the first human being drew a triangle? Or was it somehow always there? Well, if the latter, then you can see how Plato can think things like that. That somehow these standards are eternal. We didn't invent them as human beings, you know. Now, of course, not everybody is on board with him on this. The pre-Socratic philosopher Parmenides tried to argue that the things to be real had to be perfect and eternal. And we can't construct perfect triangles in this world. These exist for Plato in a world beyond the senses. Now, there's a view in mathematics today called mathematical Platonism after Plato that holds that there are some eternal truths in mathematics, and they concern objects that somehow it always was true. What makes a triangle, right? Or a circle, a square, a square. But we didn't just invent this stuff. On the other side, there's what's called constructivism that holds that these are just objects, imaginary objects we construct. That's what my geometry teachers at Poly would say. They knew that there weren't any absolutely perfect triangles in this world. But if they wanted us to think about a perfect triangle, they'd say, well, consider an imaginary triangle, you know, an imaginary equilateral triangle with three angles of exactly 60 degrees and three perfectly equal sides. We know there aren't any in this world, but think of an imaginary triangle with those properties. Well, for Plato, rather than being an imaginary triangle, a figment of our imagination, perfect triangles exist more fully than any triangle I could draw on the board. So he's trying to stand on its end what many of us think about reality. That there are some eternal standards for things that don't come in and out of existence. And it's about these things that true knowledge really has as its object. So Plato's talking about things like the property of squareness, or what he calls the square itself. In other words, for Plato, these are the things that the eternal truths of geometry are true of, these eternal objects. And they're public, accessible to anyone by their reason. Now, Plato calls, a good way to think of these is they're like blueprints, right? There's like a blueprint in this world of the forms that every square is a copy, an imperfect copy, because it's in matter of you know, the blueprint for what makes a square a square. in the realm of the form. Same thing with all geometric things. And for Plato, this also goes for abstract moral concepts like justice, like holiness or piety, like moral goodness. He thinks that there are absolute standards for these things in this other realm. Now again, this goes against the relativistic thinking of his age or the relativistic thinking that we find in our own time. So true knowledge for Plato then can only be of what is eternal and unchanging. And it has to be of the kinds of objects that Parmenides thought were really real. It can't be of the fleeting objects we see, the things that Heraclitus talked about when he talked about everything in this world changing. Of these, we can have only opinion. But the forms are like the square itself. The equal itself. I took the chalk out of, but suppose I took 2 pieces of chalk out of a new box of chalk. You know, this is what I've done before. If you held them up, you know that they'd be equal in length, right? This is an argument Socrates made. But, you know, if we had a sensitive enough measuring instrument, you know, these things aren't cut absolutely exact. We'd find that they weren't perfectly equal in length, that one would be just a tad longer than the other if we had something like a laser measuring device. So what's the point? Well, we could make a judgment, well, these 2 pieces of chalk are equal in length, but they're not perfectly equal in length. Well, Socrates says, now wait a second. How is it that you can make that ordinary judgment unless you also know at some level what perfect equality is? But no 2 things are perfectly equal in this world, in this life. No 2 lines that I draw are perfectly equal. So Socrates says, well, where'd you get your notion of perfect equality from? And he says, well, that's something you knew because you were once equated with the form of perfect equality in this other world that your soul was in touch with, you know. Now, again, there are lots of problems with a view like that, but that's Plato's contention. So what we had is what some philosophers call the epistemological argument for the forms, which reminds me that I need to go over the branches of philosophy, but we won't do that today. I'll try to remember to do that next time. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge, and the argument says in order to have real knowledge has to be about stable, eternal, unchanging things. You don't find those things in this world. You don't find those things inside the cave. You find them outside the cave in the realm of the forms. So the world outside the cave in Plato's little story represents this other world that our soul supposedly was in touch with before birth. Now, I realize you might not believe in reincarnation. I don't. I mean, there's a tradition in Christianity that, you know, there's a biblical verse that says, it is appointed unto man once to die, and after that the judgment. Ain't a lot of room in that verse for recycling people through a lot of past lives, right? You know, so I mean, generally, you know, a lot of people don't in our society. Some people do. Socrates and Plato did. But there were later Christian philosophers like Descartes who thought that we do come into the world knowing some eternal truths just like Plato thought, only we didn't learn them for them, since they were Christians like Descartes in a past life. God just put them into us at birth. You know, we come into this world with some information on our souls already. So the previous argument then justifies the existence of the forms by claiming that they're needed if we're ever to have genuine knowledge. They must exist if true knowledge is possible. Now there's another argument that deals with what is there, with the metaphysical. This is called the metaphysical argument for the forms. One question metaphysics considers is whether there's anything universal in reality or whether everything that exists is only particular. The theory of the one and the many, is there a one, like one triangle? Is there a general triangle that exists as a blueprint for all triangles? Is a general chair? I mean, there's a perfect chair in the heavens, right? That's the blueprint for what makes a chair on Plato's view. So for Plato, in his theory of the forms, besides particular chairs, there's also a universal standard for what makes a chair, a universal chair that exists in this unseen realm that our senses don't know, but that our reason puts us in touch with, and that our soul once knew in a better way. And this says if two things share a common characteristic, then there is something which they share. In other words, if two squares share the common characteristic of squareness, then there is a characteristic, a thing that they have in common. And Plato would say this is the form of squareness, and that's what makes squares squares, you know. So if two things share the same property, then actually exists a property that they share that's in this unseen realm. Now, the 20th century philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine, who was a naturalist, believed that the material world is all that exists, calls this the reification of universals. This type of an argument makes universal essences of things to be real things, and that's what they are for Plato. They're eternally existing real things. The universal essential nature of a triangle exists. It is the form of a triangle, also called triangularity. So if two things share a common characteristic, then there really exists something which they share in common, and that something exists independently of them. And the way that I had it explained to me when I learned this for the first time, when I was your age in college, was if all the chairs in the world went out of existence, on Plato's view, there would still be an eternal standard for what makes a chair in the realm of the forms, and it would still exist. Or if all particular squares went out of existence tomorrow, the property of squareness, that eternal property that defines what a square is, would still exist for Plato in this other unseen realm. So if there is a characteristic they share, then these properties exist as what Plato called forms. So if two or more things are large, they share largeness in common. I'm going to go past this because it just makes the same point again. Okay, we'll look at this. So again, this is a very different way of looking at things in the world, but at this point we're trying to understand what Plato and Socrates believed. Okay, whether you agree or disagree with it is another matter, but we're at least trying to understand it. Okay, well, sign the roll on the way out. We'll pick this up, and you can look over at the pages, but at least you might want to go and review this again. So I just recorded a Tegrity file. If all this went by